All right, class, this is the review for chapter 18, which is Texas political participation. Political participation, in its simplest definition, is that you participate in the process. You vote, you register people to vote, you attend city council meetings, you attend school board meetings, you attend town halls, you do all those sorts of things to participate in the voting process. A lot of so this data is almost 10 years old now, so some of this might still be true, but where does Texas ranked in 2010? Texas ranked 51st in voter turnout. And why was that? That's a very good question. 42nd in voter registration, 49th in the number of citizens who would contact their public official, 44th in the number of people who discuss politics a few times a week. So what does this mean? That people in Texas traditionally have not been politically engaged. What does this mean? I believe it was Beto O'Rourke when he was running for Senate against Ted Cruz. And notice the 254 counties that we have in the state of Texas, that Texas is not necessarily red or blue. It's more or less of a non-voting state. There's millions of people in the state of Texas that are eligible to vote that aren't registered to vote. Now, a big dent was made in that during this last election cycle. Obviously, it wasn't big enough to make some of the changes that some people were looking for. And it's not that I personally am looking for a one-party government, but I am looking for a government that if the parties are opposite, that the goal is not about changing one overside to the other. It's about meeting the needs of the people. How do we best meet the needs of us? And we've sent them there to do that, and they haven't done a very good job of that at all. How did African Americans and their right to vote in the state of Texas? Well, there used to be something called a poll tax, but that was where you had to pay a fee to even register to vote. So that kept a lot of people from being registered to vote, Black people specifically. The Civil War ended in 1865. The 15th Amendment came around in terms of the right to vote for some 5 years later in 1870. The problem is that it did not go far enough, and people were able to institute those poll taxes to actually keep people from voting. Southern states were able to effectively disenfranchise African Americans through their use of poll taxes, literacy tests, and other means. So by poll tax, it meant you had to pay to register. So during this time, I'm freshly free from slavery. I'm considered a sharecropper because I'm now living on the person's land that used to own me. I'm still living there and I'm working there, but I'm not really getting paid a whole lot. And yet I have to be able to afford to go pay to register to vote. Well, that's not going to happen. And let's say I did come up with the 5 cents, the nickel, whatever it was, to be able to vote. Then I get there and there's all sorts of literacy tests that I have to pass. I don't know if you ever saw the movie Selma, when Oprah Winfrey's character was attempting to register to vote. And when she got there, the question was, who were the name of all the commissioners in her county, the city county commissioners. Well, once she got there and had that completed, then the person that was denying her the right to register said, I need to know the names of all of the county commissioners in the state of Alabama. So every time we would meet the challenge, then they changed the rules. And so they are the people in power. And at that particular time, they were white people. It would take, and so she wasn't able to register. They would ask things like, how many jelly beans is in this jar? How many bubbles come out of this bar of soap? So many random things that made it difficult for people to even register to vote, which is why it troubles my soul and my spirit when I hear people now say that there's no reason to vote, or what is the purpose of voting. If for no other reason, it's for that little old lady who had to stand there and try to guesstimate how many jelly beans was in that jar. It's for that person Reverend Otis Moss Jr., whose grandfather, Reverend Otis Moss, was told on the day of voting that his polling place had changed, and he walked to the next place, which was miles away because didn't have a car back then. And by the time he got there, the polling location was closed. So that's who you vote for. That's why it's important to vote. And those are the stories that you hear, and you wonder, why are we still fighting that same battle? The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 to assist in being able to vote. In our Texas legislature, Robert Lloyd Smith was the first Black Texan elected in 1895. And it was 1966 before another African American was elected. So I want you to understand that. 1895 in the state of Texas was the first Black Texan elected to the legislature in the state. 1895. It was 1966 before another African American was elected. 1966 from 1895. Think about that. Think about that. There's been 2 from Houston and 1 from Dallas. Barbara Jordan, Curtis Graves, and Joseph Lockridge. The fact that we know their names and it's just 3 of them should say a lot. When it comes to Hispanics' right to vote, Tejanos live freely due to Mexican territory. Santa Anna fell at the Alamo in 1836. The Texas Declaration of Independence was signed. 3 Hispanic men signed it out of 55. 4 Hispanics have served in the Republic of Texas. 4 back then. The women's right to vote became because of amendments. In 1915, opponents of the women's suffrage formed the Texas Association opposed to women's suffrage. So although there was relief on the horizon, there were still groups that were fighting it, just like there are still groups fighting things today, fighting your right and access to health care. That's groups still formed to do that. Fighting access to voting, fighting access to education. So this was a group that was formed in 1915 that was opposed to women voting. In 1916, the Texas Women's Suffrage Association changed its name to the Texas Equal Suffrage Association. And it became an effective organizing tool for the state. In 1918, Texas legislature enacted a law that permitted women to vote in the primary, not the general. In 1919, in May, a referendum to amend the Texas Constitution to grant full suffrage to women while disenfranchising non-citizens failed. So what happened was there was a desire to allow women to vote, but not allow other people to vote. That failed, but then that was in May. But in June of that same year of 1919, the Texas legislature ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution because that had already passed on a federal level. Excuse me. But states had to ratify it on their own state level. And Texas became the 9th state to ratify the 19th Amendment in June of 1919. African American men were granted the right to vote in 1870 through the 15th Amendment. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote 49 years after minority men, which is around what we call Reconstruction. And it was in that Reconstruction time period that you had over 80% of people of color, specifically African Americans, Black, Negro, colored, that's what they were called back then, all of those names. 80% of them turned out to vote. The legislatures in states across the country were very diverse, as was those that were elected on a national level. But that was right after that was the Reconstruction period. And unfortunately, we have not had numbers of people turning out to vote in those high numbers of 80% or more since then. Texas had a lot of firsts as it relates to our females. Women, first elected officials was in 1922. Elected to the House was Edith. Ann Richards in 1991 was elected as governor. 1993, Kay Bailey Hutchinson was elected as a senator from the state of Texas. And this has probably continued since 2003, that there have been more Republicans represented that represent the state of Texas than Democrats. But that might change. And it's not, I'm not as concerned about the party affiliation as I am concerned about the policies that will directly impact people that look like me. And so finally, the thing that I talk about often is the ability to make your voices heard, which is through voting. Voting is how we let those know how we feel. And when we show up to vote, we usually have an impact on the system. When we don't show up to vote, then we don't have anything to say about the problems that we're facing. That's my opinion. If you did not vote during this current election because you couldn't, that's one thing. But if you didn't vote in this past election because you just didn't see the need, then it's really hard for me to have conversations with you, because it doesn't make sense that you didn't see the need when today, right now, as we speak, as I am delivering this to you, the Supreme Court is hearing oral arguments as to whether or not the Affordable Care Act, the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, is constitutional or not. Whether or not that's the ACA to some, that's Obamacare to others. I don't really care what you call it, but right now the Supreme Court is making that decision. And for millions of people, that could be a problem, especially for those who may have survived COVID, but now have a pre-existing condition, because they may not be covered by insurance, or they may be covered at a very high deductible. Because if you undo the Affordable Care Act, so goes the necessity of insurance companies to provide care and coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. And I would say out of a room full of 30 people, 25 to 28 of them have a pre-existing condition. I would guarantee that. Doesn't matter what it is, it's going to be considered a pre-existing condition. Before the Affordable Care Act, if you did not know this, before the Affordable Care Act was passed, pregnancy was considered a pre-existing condition. So if a woman got pregnant and she changed jobs or something, or maybe she didn't even know she was pregnant, and she goes to get her insurance and she finds out she's pregnant, the insurance could deny her, because that pregnancy then was considered a pre-existing condition. So because of the Affordable Care Act, A is no longer considered a pre-existing condition. But voting has an impact on that, because if you vote, then you have an impact on the senators who are responsible for seating your judicial appointees. And right now on the courts, due to a whole bunch of craziness, it is more conservative than it has been in my lifetime. And so decisions that might have a direct impact on me and my family, I'm paying close attention to, as you should as well. So that's our Texas voting. That's our political participation. And the way we do that is we vote, we register. It's a two-part process. You register, and then you actually show up to vote when it's time to vote. So that is your reviews for chapters 16, 17, and 18. Once again, please respond to me via email that you have received, and watch these videos by the 15th at 10 p.m.